Say what a pleasure it is to be back at the Hunterian in virtual form, and also to be given the opportunity to elaborate slightly on the chapter that I wrote with Marianne for this wonderful exhibition. I'm also very excited to be able to at least talk about tourism, seeing as we certainly can't practice it at the moment in Ireland. And in the absence of being able to tour or travel, it's very interesting to think about the strategies that were developed to make countries attractive and to make tourism attractive, not only for the natives of Ireland or the other countries of the British Isles, but also particularly for visitors from those other countries to, in this case, Ireland, but also the other ones. So I just want to also think about how people strategized, and what becomes evident as you study the 18th century is that there were some key people who were very ahead of their time in thinking up how to make tourism attractive, and then also how to encourage people to follow particular routes and to look at landscapes which they may have had very different perceptions of, certainly in Ireland in terms of war or difference, and how to make that attractive. And what's clear to me also, and I want to touch on at the end of this lecture, is just how much this 18th century way of thinking, the picturesque in particular, has a legacy today. And for a country that is so dependent on tourism, as Ireland and I imagine Scotland is too, how we frame those narratives today can have a profound impact on the well-being of the country and its people, particularly economically, as you move forward. So this is the image, what was particularly necessary for tourists to Ireland, and particularly from the point of view of the Protestant ascendancy that were in power throughout most of the 18th century, was that people would view and interpret the country through the correct kind of lens. And if we look at early Irish tour guides, this is the one that's in the chapter, but it has a long history that Ireland should be framed essentially through the Battle of the Boyne. So it's not just that we have some images which may be cast as military in Ireland. It's very hard to find images that are not informed by military past events and the past history of Ireland in a very arguably sectarian way, but also trying to make everyone see in the same way as they toured around Ireland on the various roads. So this is what also is being rewritten constantly through the tourist narratives, interestingly enough, is the actual history of the island, and that it is to be framed in a certain way and it's to be read in a certain way. So even something like the introduction to the antiquities of Ireland, and this is clearly not an antiquity, seeing as the Battle of the Boyne took place at the end of the 17th century, but it is being used as a framing device for how to see the country. And it bears a legacy and older patterns of kind of reproducing these battles as prints or as images that would be disseminated around Europe, particularly in this case to Holland, but also producing paintings that argued for a correct kind of viewpoint, which is the viewpoint in this case of King William III as he crosses the Boyne and moves south. And then these other more gentle, more aesthetic and more pleasing images, but they still are a form of kind of propaganda in that they are calculated to make people think in a certain very precise way about the landscape and the country that they're in. So here King William III is in a grove of trees and has become an ancient Roman general, and is also looking at the obelisk at the Battle of the Boyne in a very prescribed way. What's also the case in Ireland and possibly also in Scotland is that there are lots of kind of pockets of space and time which are arguably much older than the more avant-garde or fashionable regions around Dublin. And so this cross-section of kind of both technology and perception across the country can be quite dramatically different. So this is a map, for example, that's still being produced in Ireland in the 18th century, which is kind of a mixture of a topographic image and a kind of lease map and an ownership map. So you get this overlay, which reflects also the fact that surveying in Ireland was very much still very retardé compared to the way of measuring land that you might expect in the centre, in Britain, or in France. So you still have a kind of older way of doing things and an older way of seeing things that has to then correlate and transfer very quickly into new images or new ways of thinking. It's also the case in Ireland that we have highlands, essentially, that are very close to the capital city. So Wicklow, in the 18th century, was a large area of essentially wilderness or highland. And you get a very, just to return to that kind of image of a cross section and a very sharp cross section, you can have a relationship, a quite close in terms of distance between, say, somewhere like Blessington or in this very centre of Wicklow with what is the most urbane part of Ireland, which is Dublin. So which doesn't happen, say, for example, in London, and there isn't a highland in Lambeth. That people have to kind of interpret or deal with at that adjacency. And of course, highlands were dangerous, and they were tended to be where rebels amassed after frequently the very unsuccessful rebellions in Ireland. But that is why these kind of highly calculated images start to be produced at the end of the 18th century in Ireland. And what was interesting for me in the course of this exhibition was the degree to which Highland Scots were used essentially to populate the Irish Highlands with much more loyal Highlanders than the Irish could provide. And there are various images of that in the chapter. But to talk about the person, I suppose, who Thomas Pennant plays a similar role in Scotland, but the person who plays the most profound role, I think, in determining the course of Irish tourism and also images of Irish tourism is Arthur Young. And this is a quote from his kind of method for how to look at countries or how to travel, that nations figure by comparison, so that we're constantly comparing nations and landscapes and people to other people that we've known. And this was his method of travel, and it had a profound impact on how Ireland was perceived. His tour of Ireland was the most read and the most published and the most disseminated book about the country in the 18th century. And it's also particularly spatial because he generally wrote on the road or mapped it out on the road. And so he has a preferred kind of sequence of seeing the country. And he also has concentrations then of his own images, because what's interesting about Young is that even though he wasn't a very fine artist, he produced a lot of drawings. Now, he was fairly embarrassed by his drawings, so he didn't actually convert many of them into images, but he did convert one or three of them that I want to talk about as images for his tour of Ireland. The first one is a very acceptable one, which is that image of the Powerscope waterfall. This is his drawing on the left, and then he converted it into a frontispiece for the first volume of his tour on the right-hand side. He was one of the principal people who structured Ireland, or had a strategy for how Ireland would be picturesque, or how Ireland would become a tourist destination. And the second person I just want to briefly allude to is Jonathan Fisher, who is a successful landscape painter, but who understood very early on that combining text and image made the prospect of a country much more powerful. And you could also direct the view and ensure that people interpreted the images in the correct way by having text with them. And then by producing books of views, of course, through publishers, you have a much larger audience than if you're just producing oil paintings. And he also understood very clearly, and this in a way is a very colonial image, in that Ireland was to be viewed and interpreted from the perspective of someone arriving into Ireland, that these were the people we had to think about, not how the natives of Ireland saw Ireland. That was not important. It was very much how tourists saw Ireland. And so this is the leading image of scenery of Ireland, people arriving by boat into Dublin Bay. And as Marianne has also written in her chapter, it's a view that's very much impacted by the views they had of Wales and of England before they arrived into Dublin Bay. So that it's implicit that people have travelled probably from London to see Ireland. And that's the perspective that we need to think about And Ireland still behaves in a very kind of post-colonial way frequently in terms of trying to make sure that the country is interpreted correctly more by foreigners than people who live in Ireland, and partly because of our dependence on tourism. To this day, it's still a perspective that's very evident in the literature and kind of images that Ireland produces for consumption, even now on the internet or now in tourist literature or brochures, but we're very much concerned about how the country is seen and how other people see us. And Jonathan Fisher was also very cartographic, really, in his imagination, that he produces a map of his images and the order in which they are to be seen. So the Killarney Tour, which is Ireland's preeminent tour, is advanced by Fisher, partly because he has this strategy of connecting the images to the text and then making it even more explicit by producing a map, so that if you are particularly I'd say stupid tourist, you can literally stand in the right places on this map to see his images and to understand the sequence in which he is publishing them. So at a miniature scale, Killarney then becomes expanded essentially by Young and others into a program for the entire country, and is highly prescriptive in the strategy and who it wants to see these images. It's not particularly concerned that the natives living in these mountains would see these images. It's very much concerned that tourists, ideally coming from England, would see these images in the correct way. And of course, Ireland had a large work of conversion to do. It had had a very bad press in terms of tourism for most of the 17th century, when there was just a sequence of constant war, constant rebellion, constant massacre. So it had to really try and convert people to seeing Ireland as an attractive country. And so these are the kind of images that people had of, say, this is the west of Ireland, and in the early 18th century. So it had quite a job of work to do, essentially, in trying to make the face of the country attractive to outsiders and finally to people who lived there. Fisher was also highly prescriptive in art historical terms in determining very precisely where people should stand in the landscape to get a balance in the image between the foreground, middle ground and distance, which is the picturesque kind of structure that he implements in his images. But he also was very concerned that people would stand in the right place to see them. And this, of course, then had an impact, so that William Gilpin at the end of the 18th century starts to use Killarney essentially to define the picturesque and to contrast it with other places in Ireland. So the Giant's Causeway becomes Ireland's most scientific and, in a way, most rational and most unpoetic landscape, while Killarney becomes its most poetic and wild landscape. And again, it's important that they are distant from London, and the Wicklow Tour are distant from Dublin. And the Wicklow Tour is kind of between these kind of poles, in that it's close to Dublin. So it has elements of kind of urbane attraction and tourism, where you can do a day trip out of Dublin to Wicklow and then come back again. But at the same time, it has none of the wildness of Killarney, and this starts to become a kind of problem. So this is one of Fisher's most famous view of his most ideal image of Killarney that was obtained between, again, this lower lake and this upper lake, and this very structured kind of way of seeing the Irish landscape, which makes it very tourist friendly. But it also had to be, in a way, because you couldn't let people loose in Ireland, in a way, because they might come across very unpicturesque images or upsetting images. So it's not by accident, I think, that Ireland becomes very staged, very prescribed and very strategized in terms of its approach to how the country is to be perceived, and the role of paintings and images and text in kind of choreographing the nation, in a way, in a more presentable way, and to try and eliminate some of those nasty, upsetting narratives of war, of prejudice, of conquest and of colonization that could impact on the kind of more gentle prospects that tourism was certainly trying to advance by the end of the 18th century. We have other landscape artists who did follow in this tendency of Irish artists to produce kind of maps of their images. And it's rare for artists to move into this kind of mapping or plan-based kind of strategy for how they're going to organize and depict their images in books. This is William Ashford's kind of diagram of how he's going to represent a great house near Dublin. But it has that same kind of necessity in Ireland for having a strategy, that it can't just be left to chance. You have to have a strategy and then it'll work. Sandby, of course, is a similar strategist in the Virtuosities Museum, and a very clever strategist in terms of melding the identities of the three nations, and Wales becomes part of those four identities. And here you can see, but he's trying to mix them up essentially and sample them so that people break down those difficult political, arguably, distinctions between the four countries and kind of meld them into a more general concept of the picturesque. And of course, Wales and Scotland and Ireland, as edge countries of the British Isles, become allied pictorially at this stage in how they are depicted, and start to acquire that a similar identity, which has become apparent during the course of this project for me, and it's very interesting. But just to go back to Young, and also to his images and his strategies, I also want to talk about strategies that didn't work, and strategies where I think maybe we could do more research. And in some ways this goes into the realms of dark tourism too, which Ireland plays at quite successfully, in part because of our diaspora, and in part because we have so many Irish people all over the world who are a legacy themselves and their families of that very tragic Irish history, particularly the famine. And so it is helpful in Ireland to in the same strategic way to kind of address these issues head on in tourism strategy, because we have so many people coming to see Ireland who certainly don't have an entirely positive history of the country. And in many cases, Ireland has framed her history and has had to frame her history as a very negative history. But so I want to start with Young's project, which of course has run into very difficult troubles in the 20th century in terms of his kind of landscape of Lough Erne, which, because of the fact it's now a border country, is difficult to frame its legacy positively. And today it's very hard to construct a tourism narrative for some parts of Ireland because of essentially structural difficulties. And this is an area of Ireland which arguably had one of the most innovative ideas in terms of landscape painting, in that Thomas Roberts, who's Ireland's arguably greatest 18th century landscape painter, painted views. And usually landscape painters are for a patron, and usually landscape painters paint their paintings within the grounds of the patron's domain in Ireland or estate. But what Roberts did was, because the Lough Erne and this interlinking of an upper and a lower Lough Erne, which is a similar strategy to Killarney's, he takes views from different owners' lands, even though he's being paid by the same man. So it's a very interesting instance of essentially leaping the fence and seeing all nature as a garden, but at the same time, it's also removing the concept of property from the kind of constraints under which landscape painters typically operated. And so Lough Erne, I think, is a very important landscape. I think that Young, and this is one of Young's drawings of Lough Erne, which is copied essentially from the Roberts view that he saw hanging in one of the houses around Lough Erne. So the strategy was there, it's all correct, but we haven't been able to bring it essentially to fruition because of Ireland's subsequent history. And then I also want to talk about this other identity, which is Ireland's identity as a cabin rather than a cottage. And for those of you who know Gainsborough, you'll understand how English identity has been sometimes cast as a cottage. And unfortunately for Ireland, its identity has frequently been a cabin rather than a cottage. And Young paints this extraordinary drawing of an Irish cabin in the 1770s that he witnessed, which of course has all those issues which Irish tourism was just about to have to, deal with, and which its legacy, obviously, it had to deal with those really until the 20th century. And what Young did with this unfortunate image, of course, was to take out the more contentious elements. And so there's always that tendency in our Irish images is what exactly are they leaving out, and how much have they been edited to present a correct face for the country rather than a real face of the country. So Young does it, this is the front, but it's still extraordinary that he chooses as a frontispiece for a tour in Ireland, which is going out all over Europe as the leading work on the country for a very long period. He uses this as a frontispiece image for volume 2, not a great house, not the city of Dublin, not any of the positive images that could have been used of Ireland for this period. And its impact. He also then the third image, so that's the second image that he produces for a tour in Ireland. And the third image is taken from this, again, this amateur pencil drawing that a friend of his did of Lough Erne, and which he converted into a more presentable print for volume 2 of a tour in Ireland. Again, what he's focusing on cottages. And just to talk about the distinction between a kind of English cottage and an Irish cabin in this period. This is a Gainsborough image, where the family is obviously very well fed and at the cottage door, and the cottage door is very well constructed, and the window has glass, and it also has a chimney. And so this differs profoundly from the Irish cabin that starts to personify Ireland at the end of the 18th century. And interestingly enough, this is, again, I think, a very prescient purchase by Prince Albert in the 1840s of those kind of ruined cottages and potatoes, large numbers of potatoes, just in advance of the period when the Irish famine is about to hit. So those images carried on kind of through the centuries. And this kind of what happened in Ireland, of course, is that most of the country and the vast number of cabins that were lost to famine in the middle of the 19th century resulted in a very different landscape, which became very difficult for people to present in any kind of positive way in images. And so we have this large gap in representations of Ireland, whether real or imaginary, in the middle of the 19th century, and which talks to that characterization of Ireland as cabin in a very difficult way for people to kind of present as a positive view. And so these are the kind of images that run through the kind of representations of that cabin cottage that Young used to try and personify Ireland in a very real way. He eliminated certain elements of it, but it was still a cabin rather than a kind of Gainsborough cottage. And so these images run through Irish history with extraordinary potency up until the 20th century. They are combined, of course, with images of Irish Highlands. This is an early one in the early 19th century. Again, with very empty landscapes, very little evidence of positive improvement. And then, of course, are revitalized by people like Paul Henry in the 20th century into much more, again, at least less upsetting images of Ireland that are used constantly then to personify the country to this day. So what I've tried to do in this kind of very brief chat is to talk about those choices that people make and how they represent countries and how they use other countries to compare the country with. So the cabin cottage comparison, I think, probably runs through elements of Scotland's representation as well. The representation of estate portraits becomes very difficult in certain instances, but also helps Fisher and certainly Roberts and other landscape painters to represent Ireland positively in its literature and images in the 18th century. And so it is possible to flip or pivot the image of a country while incorporating some of these darker tourisms and darker images that still retain elements of reality within the fiction that most tourism engages with. Even and so to conclude, I started with some of the very prescribed images of Ireland coming out of the 17th century and coming out from those wars and trying to interpret Ireland and reframe particularly the Battle of the Boyne as a kind of positive history for the country. The calculated then further manipulation of that through the 18th century in a less challenging environment. Young's extraordinary honesty and dishonesty in terms of his editing in representing the real state of the country for the wider European eye. And then again, these roadblocks that the true history of Ireland tended to place in front of her simple characterization in images. And that still runs through Ireland's presentation and history today, so that we still commemorate, for example, great men in Ireland with cottages. We prefer if they live in cottages, and we use them constantly as kind of tourist images of Ireland to send to the rest of the world. So there's a very calculated and interesting kind of story of Ireland's image in the tourism literature, but also kind of in people's minds, and how we use that to frame the country both for natives, visitors, and the wider diaspora, which has such an impact on how Ireland is perceived. So that's a fairly rapid tour through images of Ireland. So I'd like to throw the floor open now to any questions people might have, if you're not feeling too ill after all those sudden transitions between the various landscapes.